A review today of the Viofo A129 Duo, which is a dual camera dashcam setup from Viofo, which they sent to me. I should say that they've given it to me, although I haven't promised to say anything especially positive. So I intend for anything I say today to be, let's say, constructive. I've been using the A119S from Viofo for the last few years, almost 2 years. And this new camera is essentially going to be an upgrade from the old one. And much of what I say in this review today will be, let's say, comparative. It's in the same class, so to say, in that it's a 5-volt USB powered camera, and it uses internal capacitors for power buffering, that being a superior alternative to using lithium-ion batteries, especially in hot weather. It's also much the same actual camera internally, because it uses the same Sony camera chip, the 1080p Sony IMX291, which also is living behind an f1.6 lens. The only real difference is that this new A129 has a apparently 140-degree angle of vision for its lens, as opposed to the old one, which has a slightly narrower 135 degrees. The advantage of the Sony chip in these cameras was seen to the greatest extent at night time. They have quite good low light performance. Now, these cameras rank highly in the various comparison reviews out there, which I should say I'm not trying to repeat here. The ballpark price for this Duo version is $170 which I have to say is not bad value. You can definitely spend more and get more, but it's still the case that 4K cameras are surely going to start making their way into dashcams. 4K video and encoding hardware is quite standard on mobile phones now, for example, and my recommendation, for what it's worth, would be to hold off on spending any higher amounts of money until 4K dashcams do become mainstream. I would really like to see this setup from Viofo in a 4K specification, for example. The body is very similar to the old version, this wedge shape, but its design is a bit more refined and looks more modern. I like the wedge shape a lot for a dashcam, as it obviously gives the lowest profile when windscreen mounted. No silly suction cup mounts with articulating arms. It just sticks straight on the screen with no nonsense. The layout of the buttons is completely different, so we'll see if that's an improvement. And this camera has other new features. Most notably, it has Wi-Fi, which allows interaction with a mobile phone via an app. And it has a proper hardwired parking mode, which I'm looking forward to trying. The problem with USB power is that it's either on or off, but this has an optional power supply which is proprietary to Viofo and enables this camera with a real parking operation. This is the rear camera. As you can see, it's a lot smaller because obviously it's just the camera with no other function, but it has a similar wedge geometry and it's intended to be mounted on the rear windscreen and sit similarly out of the way. What's of note, and the reason I actually requested this setup, is this camera is identical to the front camera. It has the same Sony chip and the same lens, so the picture quality should not differ front to back. And a lot of dual dash cams cheap out on the rear camera using lower resolution or whatever, so it's great to see consistent specifications here. Viofo supplied me with 2 of these polarizing filters. I think they're the same as what I was using on the old A119S. They serve us to cut glare and reflections from the glass mainly, and I just leave them on all the time. So on they go, and from now on everything in this review will be with these installed, as I consider them basically a permanent addition. And that's the rear camera set too. Finally, you'll notice this camera came with the GPS mount module pre-installed. That's the square bit at the top here. This provides speed and location info, obviously. It also keeps the clock time and date accurate all the time. And this GPS mount, unlike Viofo's old one, mounts sideways like this, not up and down, so the camera slides horizontally to be taken off the windscreen. Other things in the box include the requisite cabling. That big one is for the front to rear camera connection, and there are these clips which might be useful. This is the cigarette lighter plug power supply if you want to use it like that. And there's also a paper user manual which is 100% English, which is nice actually. The other thing Viofo gave me was this 64GB SD card. They sell these for a very reasonable price, although of course you can use any. But I should say that you must use MLC memory, which is more expensive than the more mainstream TLC. But dashcams hammer cards because they're writing to them full time. Now I had a 32GB card in my old setup, but with the addition of the rear camera and parking mode, I went with 64 this time, and that should still give at least 3 hours of saved prior footage. If you start the camera like this, without the card inserted, it will beep persistently because it can't record. Now this seems annoying, but obviously a dash cam that's not recording is pointless, and should the memory card fail for some reason, you need to know about it. So I'll insert the card, and we'll start it up again, and this time it will now just be working and recording. The first thing I'm going to do here is go through the menu and enable the Wi-Fi. The way this works is the camera acts as a Wi-Fi access point, which means that you have to connect your phone to it, which in turn means that you would be disconnecting from, say, your home Wi-Fi, because most Wi-Fi clients can't connect to two networks simultaneously. And that means that you would lose the internet access that you might otherwise have while you're connected to the camera. So it has its drawbacks, and I kind of wish they used Bluetooth for this instead, but it may be that Wi-Fi is required for the speed. Anyway, once it's connected, you use the Viofo app, which is available for Android and Apple, and it just connects to the camera like so. At that point, you can do two major things. One, you get a live stream of the camera video, assuming it's recording, displayed in the app like this. And two, you can access all of the camera's options through the phone app interface, which is just marginally easier than button pressing through the little menu on the camera screen. And that's really about it. You can also access recordings on the camera, and you can play them back. But honestly, I don't much care for this. It's quite slow, and if I want to pull recordings off for review, I would always use my PC or pull the SD card out and access it directly. Next thing I'm going to do is upgrade the camera's firmware, and I suggest you do this early on too, because Viofo do seem to be quite active in working on their camera's software features and fixing any bugs. Viofo sent me this camera directly and quite recently, but the firmware online is already a few versions newer. Now you can manually do this by downloading that file onto the SD card, but it appears the app allows you to do it over the internet. The only disadvantage is that now my phone isn't connected to my home Wi-Fi because it's connected to the camera, which means it's using my mobile data. Anyway, I will pay that price to show you this. And once the camera reboots, there we can see that the firmware is updated. So great. And I'll plug in the rear camera too, by the way, so everything is set up like it will be in the car. The camera alters its settings slightly automatically to accommodate the setup. You can see the picture switches to a dual picture-in-picture. I wish on the phone that this streamed both camera pictures separately so that they were displayed here separately, but I suppose it's a limitation of the bandwidth. And you can change this setting. You can swap the picture-in-picture, or you can choose either camera's stream just on its own. And by the way, another criticism I have here is that when you are connected to the camera with Wi-Fi, you cannot control it from its own buttons. These are all mainly disabled. You can't bring up the menu. What you can do is disable the Wi-Fi by long pressing the right-hand button. Anyway, with the Wi-Fi disabled, this same button cycles the picture mode, as you can see. Now, an issue with the Wi-Fi is that besides drawing a little more power, it also for some reason tanks the bitrate of the recorded video. Now, the normal 1080p 30 bitrate is over 16 megabits per second in the dual camera mode, which by the way is still a little lower than just the front camera alone. But anyway, when you enable Wi-Fi, it dives down to about half that, and the rear camera is lower still. See, this file is just under 7 megabits per second. Now, I presume that this is so that it can stream the same video stream to the phone across the Wi-Fi, but it's a real reason to not use it once you've finished any setup using the app, because this lower bitrate really starts to have real consequences with regard to picture quality. You get a lot of blocking and lost detail at those low data rates. I was also kind of wondering if you might not be able to set things up so that you could tap an icon on your phone and get a sort of make-do rear vision camera. And it sort of works, but for all the reasons I just discussed above, it's really not practical. One major point that it's necessary to make is, as you can see on the screen, when the rear camera is plugged in, the video mode freezes at this 1080 plus 1080 setting, and in the menu there is no other option. And without the second camera, you get 1080p at 60 frames per second, and you can also dial the quality down if you wanted. But when you're recording with the dual setup, you only get each video stream at 1080p 30 frames per second. So that's quite a drawback, and since I'm reviewing this as the Duo unit, I have to consider it as only essentially a 30 frames per second camera, and that's what you're going to see in most of the demo footage I show you. I presume that's again to do with processing limitations, but it is a pity that Viofo couldn't keep both cameras at 60 frames per second. Another video option of note is the WDR, or wide dynamic range, which I will switch on and leave on since I have it enabled on my A119, and it seems to make an improvement. All it seems to do is apply an inverted S-gamma curve to the video before it's encoded, which in layman terms means it just sort of flattens the picture out a bit by boosting blacks and dipping whites. And that's not to make the photography any prettier, but rather to decrease the likelihood of destroying detail that you might want to look at, like license plates. So I recommend using it. There are other features to play with in the menu. I think the defaults are pretty good. You might like to tweak the sensitivity of the G-Shock sensor, which marks read-only footage in the event of a shock, like an accident. I set it to low because I find that potholes and the like tend to give false positives when it's set to high. You also need to turn the GPS on manually. It does not auto-enable. And then I like to turn the GPS info stamp off. Otherwise the camera bakes the current speed and location into the video picture, which I don't think is a good idea from a legal point of view. The data is still recorded, it's just kept separately in the metadata of the file, and so it requires a compatible player application to read it, which I'm fine with. And you can see here as I play this example back in the free Dashcam viewer software for Windows. The GPS info is not in the actual video, but the data is nevertheless accessible, and you can see that the speed and location is being properly reported throughout the period of this particular video, so it all works fine. Now, this camera will be getting hardwired into my car. I think the rear camera, along with the parking mode features, essentially require that, in my view. And Viofo supply an optional 3-wire power supply hardwire kit at a very reasonable price. And unlike the regular USB power setup, it connects up to the car's ignition or accessory circuit as well as permanent power, so that it knows when to switch into its parking mode. And it also has this power saver box built into it that will kill the camera once the car's battery voltage drops below a certain level, meaning that the parking mode, if left on, can never flatten the battery. If you are using this kit, there is a minor flaw in the design, which is that the power cable has to go in the side power socket on the camera, not the GPS mount socket, which is at the back. That's the one I was using with the white cable here. It's only the side socket that works with the 3-wire ignition circuit setup. So the cable does have a right-angled connector on it, which is good, but it's still a little less elegant. And what's worse is that the rear camera cable also plugs into the side here with its own right-angle plug, and they don't really clear each other properly. So you end up with a rear camera cable sort of having to bend around the power plug like this, and it just looks like it wasn't really thought out properly. Ideally, both cables would run to the GPS mount so that they'd be neat and out of the way, And that would also allow the camera to be demounted and removed from the car without having to unplug and reconnect both cables each time. But look, nothing's perfect. And if you want to see more about that being set up, then make sure to watch the separate install video. In short, I have the kit set up at my fuse box, which is behind this car's glove box, and the cables are all hidden as they run up to the front camera, and then back to the rear, which is tucked away at the top of the rear hatch. So let's look at the video results, which at the end of the day is what really matters. All of this is at the 1080p 30 setting because I'm using the rear camera as well. And now the picture quality of a dash cam is never amazing in terms of photography, but it's not intended to be. The dynamic range is bad, the colors are bad, it's way over sharpened, it's noisy and so on. But you should remember this is a relatively cheap car camera and it's meant to record driving happenings. It's not supposed to produce pretty film. So in terms of reading license plates, which is a good benchmark for the purpose, it does hold up okay, although as with the old A119, the results are mixed. In good lighting, even at high open road speeds, it's very possible to freeze the picture and get a good reading. You can read most of these plates, but for those vehicles at more distance or in poorer lighting, it can be harder. Mostly you'll be able to find a frame that does work. This is on the same day, but giving the camera a little bit more of a challenge with the sun directly in the frame ahead, and also coming and going. So it's nice to see that the lens does not get washed out in stray light like a cheap plastic lens might, and also that the auto exposure adjustments seem to be up to it. I think this is pretty respectable, all things considered. The great advantage of the Sony chips was always their low light performance, and you can see going into evening on a dismal day here, the exposure and the picture holds up very well. Remember, this is with the WDR setting on, and I think it does help. And this is the rear camera. Mine's mounted on my rear windscreen in such a way that it's not in the arc of the windscreen wiper. Which means that when it's raining you get this problem with the water, but it still gets a pretty usable picture, and this definitely adds a lot of context to what's happening around the car. At night time the picture does start to degrade for sure, but so long as you're not talking about pitch darkness, it's certainly still usable. The front and the rear definitely captures the full situation. I'm really happy with the addition of the rear camera actually. As far as plates go, it can actually be useful in the sense that it can give you a sort of extra chance if and when the front camera fails you. For example, say you wanted the plate on this silver car I'm overtaking here. The front view it's pretty hard to see. It's not clear at all that you'd be able to get that plate. But on the rear view, despite the fact that we're now looking back, against other cars' headlights, it just so happens that a few frames here give a better view of this car's front plate, and it's definitely readable. Okay, so that's the driving footage, and now the major extra feature when it's hardwired into the car, which is the specific parking modes. So as I explained before, if the camera is set up properly, these will activate when you turn off the car's ignition or accessory circuit, so as to use less electrical power and also use up less space on the memory card. There is a buffered auto event detection mode, which triggers a minute of recording, including a few seconds prior to anything interesting happening. It has two related settings: G-sensor sensitivity, which is at high by default for if anything hits the car, and then also motion sensitivity, which means that the picture's analyzed by the camera for visual changes in order to try to catch anything dodgy. I ended up setting this to low because it tended to capture just too many minor things and also exposure changes every time a cloud went by. Even on low though, the reality is that a wide-angle picture from two different cameras placed out in the real world always tends to be capturing some motion of some sort, unless you live in a really boring part of the world, or maybe if you're talking about the inside of a closed garage. Which means that it tends to constantly be triggered, and you can't turn the motion detection off completely, and at least not in the current version of the firmware, so it's just to rely on the G sensor. And all of that means a lot of wasted card space with useless recordings. And I personally would only get about 5 to 6 hours of recording time before the battery saver killed the camera. The other parking options are constant monitoring. Firstly, there's this constant record real-time but low bitrate option, which works well, but it's really OTT for a parking mode. It uses less space than in the driving mode because the files come in at about 4 megabits per second. But the footage quality does tend to hold up because the picture's obviously mostly still when parked, which means the codec has an easier time. But this mode still ends up occupying the card with hundreds of little files, and overnight it will tend to overwrite the previous day's driving footage unless you have a very large memory card. And it's very time consuming to then go through and find a particular incident if you ever needed to. So I wouldn't suggest using this unless you're really paranoid and you actually want 24/7 monitoring of the situation. And lastly, there are these reduced frame rate options which turn off audio recording and just produce a time-lapse video because they're encoded to playback at 30 frames per second regardless. For example, this is at the 5 frames per second recording option. If you play the video file normally, you get this sped up result. Or if you were to slow it down and play it at real time, you get this. Now this gives you a good compromise between full-time security and card space and file management. And I'd say it's pretty good. As far as power usage is concerned, in my experience using the hardwire kit set to the most conservative 12.4 volt option, I would get about 12 hours of service before the power saver cut out, which is enough to stretch overnight, for example, if you're using the card daily. Now, that's just my battery in the current temperature here in winter, so your experience will vary accordingly, but that's just to give you a ballpark idea. So this mode is what I decided to use for the time being. I would like it if this low frame rate mode could be event triggered so as to cut out the truly extraneous recordings, but it certainly works okay as is. So that is my review of the Viofo A129 Duo. I have a generally positive opinion of it. I think it's a pretty good dashcam setup, especially for the money. I think it really is a strong contender in this sort of value price point of the market, and you can only really improve on the technical features, so to say, by spending quite a lot more money. And that's where the room for improvement will lie in the future. Hopefully Viofo can come out with 4K cameras and ones using better quality camera chips and HEVC codecs, which will require more computing power in the little onboard chips. So that's something for the future, but for now this is about as good as you can get for the money, so well recommended for sure. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Have fun.